This Choir Cast podcast episode is brought to you by Maria Francesca French, author of the newly released book, Safer Than the Known Way, A Post-Christian Journey. If you have moved past traditional notions of God, beyond mechanisms of belief, and find yourself relentlessly curious about what might be next, this book is for you. This and more in my new book, Safer Than the Known Way, A Post-Christian Journey, out now.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney and Bethany Shea.
Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. That's right. N-A-T, the Nat, the N-A-T, like Nat King Cole, John. That's what I always used to tell people. I don't know. And then sometimes they wonder if that's actually my name. And I said, no, it's not. I actually worked with a guy. I still work with a guy who I've worked with for over a year now. We share an office together and he still calls me Nate. Well, because this is my lot in life. So we should talk about maybe how people have screwed up our names all these years. But I'm Nat. I'm here with my brother, John, and also our lovely co-host, our bonus host. Our Bo host. Wow. I legit just came up with that.
Yeah. You should probably figure out how to keep that on. A co-host
and a Bo host. Bethany Shea. How are you, Bethany?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm stupendous. I'm still reeling. Stupendous. I'm fantabulous. I just saw Wicked, so now I'm making words up.
That's right. You wrote about it on Facebook. Oh my goodness.
God, it's so good. We should have a whole episode talking about Wicked because John and you I know John's a theater nut. I don't know.
Yeah, I need to go see it.
Are you also a theater nut?
Not a theater nut, but I have seen Wicked in the theater and it was excellent.
John's a bigger theater nut than I am, but I am a bona fide Broadway geek. I've been to lots and lots and lots of Broadway shows, and Wicked I saw 3 or 4 years ago. And I wish I'd seen the original cast, obviously. Would have been amazing. But even so, still blew my mind. And the movie is killer.
I can't wait.
I'm seeing Ariana Grande in a whole new way because holy crap, that girl can sing. And but anyway, all of that being said, I'm feeling great, and I'm just going to make up words now in honor of the premiere of the Wicked movie. But we are here. This is the podcast. We call it "This Is Not Church" because if it was church, you'd have left by now. Or maybe it's because this is the kind of church you maybe always wanted to attend, where people talked about like relevant things like theater and art and music, and not just how everyone's going to go to hell, which becomes really tiresome after a while. At some point I started to wonder if everyone's going to hell, then, what's the point of all this? Because pretty much everyone thinks everyone's going to hell. And I don't know. But we are here, as always, with an awesome guest. And so let's do that instead of me just sitting here and making stuff up and rambling. We'll introduce our guest and we'll go off and we'll do what we do and we'll have a great conversation. So we are here with Liz Charlotte Grant. She's an award-winning writer whose work has been published in The Revealer, Sojourners, Brevity, Christian Century, Christianity Today, Hippocampus, Religion News Service, U.S. Catholic, Huffington Post, and elsewhere. Her essays have twice won a Jacques Maritain Nonfiction Prize. I probably butchered the second name. She also writes The Empathy List, a popular newsletter that has been nominated for a Webby 2 years running and garnered an honorable mention from the Associated Press Awards in 2023. Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible is her first book. Let me say that title again. Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible, which is an awesome title, and I can't wait to hear all about it. Welcome to the podcast. How are you, Liz?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming. We like to start off the conversation an awful lot, especially when we're talking to about faith-based stuff, or maybe get a little bit of people's background, their religious upbringing. If you're comfortable filling us in on a little bit of that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I grew up white American evangelical. For those unaware, I am white and American and female. So my experience in evangelicalism was in some ways privileged, in some ways I was pushed to the margins. So, within my family, that was kind of its own dysfunctional culture. And that actually led me eventually toward a sort of deconstruction. But I think really I was raised in this like CCM, Bill Hybels kind of evangelicalism, this like seeker sensitive.
Bill Hybels. I haven't heard that name in a while.
It was pretty unserious. I think as I've thought back, I went to an evangelical school, a really conservative evangelical university. And that was the first time I heard the word evangelical in a theology class.
Wow.
I'd never heard that word before. I grew up in the church, prayed the prayer at age 4. So that gives you kind of a sense of my upbringing, but I was always kind of the serious kid in the room. So I was very interested in the deeper questions, and I was like on all the youth group trips and all that. So I was that kind of kid.
I mean, wasn't that always the knock though on the so-called like I haven't heard the term seeker sensitive in a long time either. Mm-hmm. That was always the knock because they weren't very serious,
right? Right.
Like
they didn't talk about John Calvin enough.
No, and they, I mean, I think of Bill Hybels in particular. I was, he was the model for a lot of us, and if we were planting churches, or if we were working at sort of non-denoms, because he had sort of crafted this whole idea of, okay, let's have a wide on-ramp. Let's not really get deep in the weeds theologically. That was what my pastor for years, that was his model was, well, we don't, we have small groups and things for those kinds of deeper theological questions. And Sunday morning was about rolling out the red carpet and making a very parishioner-centric service.
Yeah, very approachable.
Good music and, a funny, good communicator, or somebody who could, not offensive, but you were there asking the big questions. Did you find that you were you rebuffed? Were you not giving good answers, or were you asked to shut the hell up? Because I've had a little bit of all three.
Yeah, it depends on which setting I was in. I later interned in a Acts 29 church, which was a mess because at the time I was 30 years old, a mom of two already, and peers with the pastors. So you can imagine, but I had not gone to seminary, but just had a lot of experience in church and leadership and all sorts of other things, run a business, so I'm coming in like a little too hot for them. It's like a little too much feedback. And
isn't an Acts 29 church a little bit more conservative? Like it's from, what was that guy's name?
Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll. Yeah. So how were you able to
I didn't make that connection. Yikes.
Yeah. How were you able to intern there as a female? And what was that like for you?
Yeah, good question. I was not a pastoral intern.
Oh, okay.
So I was doing lay counseling, and I decided to do this internship, asked if I could do it because I wanted to decide, do I want to do pastoral ministry or do I want to do become an LPC and become a therapist, actually. And so I thought this would be kind of a good in-between. And I was very clear with anybody I met with, I'm not a therapist. Please get a therapist. This is not meant to be healthcare in any way. This is only me sitting with you, praying with you, talking with you, doing what we can, from a volunteer perspective. But yeah, I would say in that church, I experienced the most probably overt sexism. I think before that, I had always I had been in these circles of evangelicalism that were fairly female friendly. So even if they wouldn't let someone be a pastor, women were still teaching. They were still up front. They were still, there wasn't really a clear divide. And that was part of the seeker sensitive. It was how do we get the most people in the door? Well, we're definitely not going to lead with, hey, women should only teach children. You're not even allowed to teach your sons, right?
Yeah.
When they become teenagers, now you can't say anything to them, So and that's really what they believed, but it really, they hit it pretty well. So then when I got into these, I was drawn into the Acts 29 circles because I was very interested in the way that they were talking about church planting, actually. Mm-hmm. They were talking about relational evangelism. And I was I can get behind that. I like that.
Yeah, it was a compelling movement for sure. And I think it still is in a lot of ways, depending on your flavor of Christianity. But yeah, there was something really compelling about that season for sure. And it makes sense that you would find yourself in it, being somebody who grew up in a Christian way and also just having those sorts of questions. How can we do church differently? And that was a form of doing church differently.
Yeah, especially that relational question. I was I'm not really interested in apologetics and throwing answers at people. I've just never been that person. I'm a deep feeler. I've always been really artistic and creative and weird, so it hasn't been interesting to me to be I would like to sit down and talk about the 4 spiritual laws with you. It's just I am so bored by that question. I'm not even going to go there, but give me Madeleine L'Engle and I'll read that all day. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was compelling to me to think about a different sort of church, and I knew that I was probably ill-fitted for the community, but I also sort of, in evangelical parlance, I felt like I had a heart for those people. I was like, I see, and I was working with people on the very outskirts of that church. I mean, it was like people in recovery. It was people who were about to get divorced, or usually women whose husbands were addicted to something and they just didn't know what to do. There was one case of marital rape, which was really sad and hard. So it was those kind of situations, and I'm not there as a professional. I'm there as like a trusted friend. And that was a super meaningful experience to get to do. I don't regret that at all. In fact, I think being able to walk with people in such tender times. I had just kind of come off of a career of being a birth doula. So I love those kind of moments in people's lives when they have something big, something explodes, in themselves, in their lives. They don't know what to make of it. I like just sitting with them. And so, for me, that was a really great role in that way. It just was a very dysfunctional church culture and staff culture, and there were all sorts of problems. But it's been kind of a slow journey. I'm like in the main line now. It's taken several steps out. Like I was in an ACNA church for a while, which is a Anglican Church of North America. It's like the conservative branch of Episcopalianism. I was in that for a while. I tried lots of different things, but I have found kind of safety in being a part of some of these larger mainline churches where I'm not volunteering for anything. Just sitting and participating in the ritual with these other people. But it's been a journey.
You said that you like to ask questions. I'm curious what kind of questions you were asking.
I think they had more to do with praxis, so like orthopraxy. So it was more like if we really care about the poor, like if Jesus really cares about the poor, then why aren't we doing anything for the unhoused? If the marginalized are kind of the center of the story, then why are we ignoring them? And I think initially my questions centered around kind of family dysfunction, seeing like, okay, so there's this structure in my family and supposedly there's this hierarchy, but what if the person at the top is not trustworthy? What if the leadership structure fails? What if there's abuse? What if so those kind of questions were the things that really animated me. I wasn't really interested. It's so funny because I wasn't really interested in theology. Like it was interesting to me, maybe conceptually, but I have always wanted to know, how does it actually connect to the ground? Like how does it connect to kind of our flesh and bones, like real life? So I wasn't really interested in the question of what did 2,000 years of even church history think about women in ministry. I was like, what does it look like at this church for women to serve and to be respected and dignified here, So I just was kind of like, yeah, you can say whatever you want about those things. Fine. Like I'm willing to like trust you or even have a conversation about it or be wrong even. But when it comes down to how do we actually treat people, that matters a lot more to me than what sort of high-minded, lofty ideals we have.
No, those are all really, they're very good questions. And that's kind of what, for a long time, I was neck deep in theology. I lived for that. And so I'm well-versed in a lot of things. And then at some point in my deconstruction, I just got to a point, I was talking to my former co-pastor about this, and we both had arrived at this place where we just don't care that much anymore. Mm-hmm. And the focus had shifted to exactly what you're talking about. That's all great. That's all fine. High-minded. It's all good conceptually. It's all good to think about these things in the abstract. But what does that mean for the day-to-day? How does this actually play out? And what really got me was that for most churches, and again, painting with a pretty broad brush, but for American churches in particular, it doesn't play out. It just doesn't. The model that's being employed by a high, I wouldn't even venture to guess the percentage, but a high percentage, I would imagine, were churches like mine that were 95% focused inward, 95% focused on what was going to serve them, and their little micro community, and then a tiny little bit every once in a while, a gesture of something that would at least appear that you gave a shit about what was happening outside your four walls. And that got to me after a while. I'm like, the hypocrisy of it. And so that it eventually led me to split with all of it and say, well, okay, because I don't see it. I don't see a lot of, and again, I know there are churches who are doing things. I know, in fact, I have friends who are in churches who are doing way more with way less. But always the bigger and the more influential churches in any town I've lived in are of that more common variety of let's have really good resources here. Has that also been, I mean, Mark Driscoll's a pretty good example of that, of having a very dysfunctional. I had friends who interned at Mars Hill in Seattle, right in the middle of it all going to hell. And so it just blew their lives up. But I don't know how much interaction. Did you have any interaction with Mark Driscoll? Or was this just a Mark Driscoll affiliated movement?
No, it was part of, it was his church planting network that he created. So, no real affiliation with Mark, which, I mean, I'm so glad.
That's probably why it still survives.
Yeah.
Because the rest of it seemed like it all kind of scattered to the four winds. And I think there were some independent churches who decided, I haven't paid very little attention to it since, but I know at the time it all went down, there were churches who were just going to like disaffiliate from Mark and continue on with what they were doing in that part of Washington state in particular. But
there continues to be like a strand of that sort of Christian expression, maybe church planting expression. And yeah, I mean, these things are unfortunately kind of resilient.
They persist.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, but narcissism is at the root of that. And so you just kind of hope that, that people become more wise to it. But
did you have experience with any other church planting organizations or just Acts 29?
I think that was all.
No, I was just curious because to me, so my church was affiliated with a big organization called ARC, and that was the Association of Related Churches. And they planted tens of thousands of churches all across America. But it becomes almost like its own denomination. I mean, they're not the ones planting the churches, but their fingerprints are on all of it.
Yeah.
And to the degree that they're actually financially invested in any of those churches, their fingerprints are really on it. So I just to me, it seemed like a way to sort of sidestep, like they could still pay lip service to, well, we don't buy off on this whole denomination thing. And yet they were creating this massive organization, network of people who all kind of had the same DNA and all sort of carried the same organizational structure. And you know what I mean? So it just seemed another instance of praxis, just being played out. But I just was curious if you'd had that experience or not.
Yeah, I was, I just think it's so fascinating, the kind of life that you've lived. And from you mentioned in your book, the Adventures in Odyssey Bible that you had when you were a child. And I was just like,
I did.
Yeah, that was like so relevant in my life for sure. So going from that to being at a church that was very seeker sensitive, to then being at an Acts 29, to now being in a mainline, and all of these parts of your life when it comes to your faith has kind of propelled you to now, where you wrote this incredible book, Knock at the Sky. I mean, it's just like you take these large concepts of this beautiful book of Genesis and you make it super relevant. You make it so, like, I'm so curious about Genesis now. I'm reading it with a new lens, like with new eyes. And you captured that. How did you do that? How did this burden come on you to write something like this? Especially for a first book. It's incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for those kind words. I have written books before this, to be honest.
Okay.
So let's say this is definitely my first published book.
Yes.
This one was strange. So I set out initially to write a book on the prophets because I've always been very curious about, those are kind of the strangest stories in the Bible. And I Ezekiel on his side, cooking his food over shit. It's like
no.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
It's just wild. So anyway, I started there, and that will actually probably be the next book, but I became really obsessed with the idea of God's voice because, of course, the voice of God is what animates the prophets, at least in the, whether it's historical, not, and I get into this in my book, but I'm not very interested in the historicity question. And it's not that that's not important. It's just that I would rather immerse myself in the world created by these writers. And so if I just sort of take these words seriously and attend to them, what world is created here in these words? In the world of the Bible, the prophets are animated by the voice of God. And so I started thinking about where does the voice first show up? Well, way back in Genesis, by the way, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God creates with God's voice. And so I started thinking a lot about getting really practical about how does God actually speak? Because in order to speak, typically you need a throat, you need a container, you need something to be able to echo and pronounce the words. You need lips and gums and teeth and spit. And God, of course, doesn't have a throat, according to these authors. God is bodiless and spirit. And so I became very interested in kind of thinking through how that happens. And I happened to be at a writing residency at the time and had a really good friend and fellow writer, who was leading the workshop, and he was reading pages from our days. We would write, and then he would read some pages that we'd written and give us feedback the next day. It was really interesting. And he said, this is really interesting. He was really compelled by it. And I was like, oh, I didn't think I was writing about this. This was kind of a side project. I didn't mean to write about this. But as I kind of got into it, I started being really interested in this question of early encounters. What do these early encounters with divinity look like according to this literary work? How are these early ancient peoples experiencing divinity and the supernatural? And what are their experiences with this God? So whether you're Christian or not, I think it is fascinating to think about what did our ancestors think about divinity, about the spiritual realm, about how they interacted with that realm. And a lot of the things that we bring to the text, of course, they just didn't have. They didn't have those lenses, of thousands of years of history, of writings around the same deity. And so I was interested in, what does it feel like to kind of get on the ground and experience what they did through their eyes without kind of a lot of the baggage. I don't know. I think I mentioned Jesus once or twice, but I really don't mention Jesus because I want to just engage with the characters and the themes and the words as they are in this context. And I found that much more interesting. So I guess the short answer from this very long answer is that I started just to become very curious. I just had a lot of questions that were very concrete that I wanted to bring to the text and kind of see what I could find there.
Yeah, and you really keep it open for people to read. When they read it, they can find Jesus in it if they want to. But the text wasn't written to find Jesus in. And you're able just to be really faithful to the original text and to bring a new layer of meaning to it that I think, at least for myself, I had never really experienced before. When you write about the whale sounds and that guttural sort of sense, I kept thinking of this word that Jesus uses all the time in his teachings, or the scripture uses in regards to Jesus, where it says that he was moved with compassion, and that word is splanknon, that feeling in your gut, the sense of I am being moved with compassion because of my gut. And I just kept thinking about those sounds that the whales were making and how connecting it is to the Holy Spirit and that groaning sound that happens. I don't know, you just the way that you put this all together was so compelling. And yeah, I really appreciated it.
Yeah, for those who obviously haven't read my book.
Yeah.
Although you should, by the way. But
Definitely.
it is the first chapter I write about God's throat. And so then I started thinking about God as this kind of alien. And so I started thinking about like, what are other aliens that we know of and how do they speak differently than we speak? And I just kind of went back to whale song and tried to figure out, how do whales actually communicate and why do they communicate that way? I told the story of the man who first recorded whale song. He was like a Navy sonar engineer and he thought he was recording communist submarines at first, Soviet submarines. He wasn't. He was recording whales. But I was very interested just to discover that researchers don't actually know why whales sing. They know that they kind of sing through bellows in their guts, like it's all these different chambers, kind of like gas moving around, but it's intentional. And they are the ones who move it around and to sing these songs. But they actually don't know why. Like they thought maybe it was a mating thing, but that's been disproven. And they thought, well, maybe it's just, a communication thing. But then there are these young sperm whales that gather, I think, off the coast of Indonesia every year for their own like whale Burning Man, and they all sing together. It's like they're just like a corral of whales off the coast of Indonesia. And why would they do that if it were just about communication? They like go off of their migration routes just to go to this place and meet each other.
Whale Burning Man.
I love that.
It's going to be, that's my takeaway.
It's going to be huge.
I think it will be. I mean, start selling tickets now. I mean, but the Genesis has always been fascinating to me. And and one of the things that I've lamented over the years is how much damage we've done to that text by literalizing it. Like we've made it really boring and because Genesis contains some of the most problematic stories to be taken literally. I mean, if you end up, with Ken Ham or Ken Hovind, or you end up with these guys who build giant replicas of the Ark and try to smash evolution into, if you insist that these stories are literal representations of history, and then you miss potentially this enormous amount of other truth that like you did, like they never stopped to ask the bigger question. Like, okay, well, fine, literal, not literal, who cares? What's the story why would they tell this story at all? There's got to be something more to the flood account than simply God got pissed off and killed a bunch of people. Dear God, I hope there's more to it than that. There's got to be more to the Tower of Babel story than simply God was threatened and decided to confuse people's language. There has to be. And so whether you view it as maybe like someone like Rob Bell would say and talks about, the creation story in particular as poetry. It's actually, and I'm sure you know this already, but it's even sort of written in stanzas there's a very poetic form to the creation stories, whether it's polemic, because, I read somebody who was making the argument that so many of these stories were written post Babylonian exile, that this was really a lot about Jewish and is Jewish people asserting their own identity over some fairly common creation and flood myths. That's interesting. Why would they do that? So I mean, all these really, really interesting questions that are so much more interesting than was there really did Noah really get 2 of every kind of the animals on the ark and how did he do that? But I don't know. If
I did visit the Ark this year, actually. I did visit the Ark.
Oh, okay. Now you have to tell us about that because I'm fascinated by the Ark. I have friends who've gone.
Yeah. Do you guys know about this?
You're talking about Ken Ham's, right?
The replica one? Yeah, Ken Ham one.
The one that last year or earlier this year, he had to take out flood insurance on. Or
He did not.
He did.
No.
They had a massive amount of rain in Kentucky this year, and he actually had to file a claim on his insurance, and it was flood damage to the Ark.
That is hilarious. Oh my
That's
God.
so
Make
wild.
this shit up.
No, you cannot. I mean, what was wild is, it's an amazing structure. So I have some family out there. We were out there visiting them and then took a field trip. And
as you do. What else do you do in Kentucky besides drink whiskey? Which is why
I gotta go. Yeah. We were with some kind of dry family members, so that wasn't going to happen. We made our own trips, kind of trip within a trip. But we went to the Ark, and it's this huge structure, totally made out of wood, one of the largest timber frame structures in North America. And it's an incredible and impressive building. You like walk in and it's dark, and they have all these like clay lamps, which are supposedly, they can't actually be lit by oil, but like they're kind of, trying to evoke that. And I mean, it felt like a theme park, it felt like a legit theme park, and you're walking in and there are all these bamboo cages and animatronic animals in the cages. Especially dinosaurs. There were
the dinosaurs get
so
me.
many.
Oh my gosh.
There were so many dinosaurs. There were probably like 25 animatronic dinosaurs. And I was like, I didn't even know there was one on the Ark, to be honest. Like, it doesn't actually mention it. I know, yes.
Pretty sure we have some geologic epics that separate. But
oh my goodness.
does not believe that, though. This is all.
Yeah. This is the problem is, you kind of walk up. So the bottom is like dark and you're just looking around. The top starts to talk about the Ark and the times and why God had to send floods. And my favorite was there's a a diorama of like a Colosseum and these tiny little people are fighting each other. And then on the right, you see coming out of kind of a cave is a T-Rex that they are fighting.
Oh my God.
That's why God had to flood the earth, just so you know.
Because we had gladiators fighting T-Rexes?
Correct.
And that was...
it was a step too far.
Just that, I'm sorry, I can put up with a lot. But I feel like that scene in Dumb and Dumber when he's like, we can't find jobs, our pets' heads are falling off. We got gladiators fighting T-Rexes. One of my favorite YouTubers at the moment is a PhD evolutionary biologist whose name is Erica, and she's got her YouTube name is The Gutsick Gibbon, and she's brilliant. She's really, really brilliant. But she was also raised up until through middle school in a very, very conservative evangelical private Christian school. And so she and her mom, a couple years ago, went to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter and videoed their experience there. Mm-hmm. And she tore that thing up. And she's just like, let me explain to you how dumb all of this is. like from the science perspective. And she's crunched the numbers on all of this. She's like, there's not even enough room on that Ark for one species of elephant and the food that they would need. It would take up like 45 or 50% of the entire Ark for one species of it, which then at the end of the Ark, at the end of the flood, would have then had to have diversified into however species of elephant there are today. And that would have had to have happened in a compressed amount of time. Anyway, she's like, this is just beyond.
Just the level.
Beyond, and it's one animal. And then you throw dinosaurs in the mix and it's all.
Oh,
and that's what that literal reading does to you when you take, a hard line young earth creation, which forces you to be a science denier, which forces you to make a stand on things that are demonstrably not true. And then but you then continue to paint yourself to a corner, and what it does is I go back to what I said about my atheist friends who then look at that and go, I can't take any of this seriously now. Like there might be all kinds of gold in the Old Testament that they just can't take it seriously because of the damage that people like this do who insist that there was a literal Tower of Babel or there was a literal, that we all are evolved from one set of human beings 6,000 years ago. And from that, we have all this biodiversity. And anyway, so I like books like yours because I hope what they do is they break that open for us and allow us to ask better questions, much more interesting questions. Because to me, there's no shame in saying, I don't know what they meant by this. Let's talk about it. Let's take the more Jewish approach to the scriptures and wrestle with them and argue with them and sometimes, oh my God, disagree with them. And because there's some stuff in the Old Testament that we need to probably think about, like, okay, that's terrible. When God tells people how to own slaves, what they should pay for them, the ways in which they can mistreat them, that's probably not a great thing for us to do, for us to try and emulate in 21st century America, right? I mean, the Bible has been used to prop up all kinds of garbage stuff. But anyway, I'm just ranting. I don't really have it in any discernible way that I'm going. So Bethany saved me.
Oh no, I was just going to say that, like, the way that you wrote this book, though, and not taking a stance of historicity and like saying this is how it is, you don't have to make sense of it all in order to find wisdom and meaning and purpose in this beautiful book of the story of God and humans, God and this earth. And I think that was really wise of you to do that. I mean, there's already so many books out there that have to do with proving Genesis right or wrong or trying to make a case about it. And what you chose to do, I think, created a really beautiful picture of engagement, of like, we get to engage with this text in a way that actually makes sense to us and can actually shape us as humans into ones that can hear the voice of God differently. It was just really incredible. Did you, was it hard for you to let go of that history piece and trying to prove things as you went? Or what was that experience like for you?
I mean, I think there is a sense where you kind of need to settle on a reading, an interpretation. You know, I can't just like endlessly like circle, even though I tried. My editors didn't like that. I had multiple editors for this book because I am not an MDiv. I'm not a theologian. So I had a theological edit from a very smart ancient Near Eastern scholar. I had a science fact check. I had a developmental edit. I had all these things, you know, because I'm not the expert on it, you know. So I think that was kind of part of that strategy was like, I don't actually have to be the expert if I write it this way. Like I'm a creative writer. So if I can approach it like a creative writer and leave the expertise to the experts, you know, then I'm staying in my lane, number one. But also I'm not really interested in it and I can trust those people to have those conversations. But I did have to kind of settle on something for each chapter. And that was a challenge, I think. You know, I had to figure it out for myself. I think that one of the harder ones for me was the story of Abraham and Isaac on Mount Horeb, where Abraham is told by God, go kill your son, your only son, on the top of this mountain, sacrifice him to me in a form of worship. And that is just that's like an impossible passage. I mean, how can you settle on anything there without just losing faith? I mean, that's kind of where I settled, was like, I don't feel like I have to defend the deity, but I also have to understand for myself and approach it honestly and say, what do I do with this? I'm not sure. You know, the most kind of convincing answer that I came to was related to the rabbinic interpretation. So I do a lot of work with the Midrash, the Jewish Midrash, like the Mishnah, which are sort of legends and stories that surround the biblical text. They often like fill in these gaps in the white space of the text. So like between the words, between the paragraphs, you know, the kind of backstory. And I found the Jewish interpretation interesting in that they said, actually, God didn't say to sacrifice Isaac. God said to bind Isaac. They actually, in the Jewish imagination and history, they have read this story as the binding of Isaac. I don't particularly find that compelling, only because, I mean, I find it really interesting. I think what I don't find compelling is kind of doing the backbends around the hard passages, because sometimes it does feel like, same with like the story of Abraham and Hagar, which is a mess. Like, I mean, just, you know, like the way that Christians and Jewish people sometimes too, although I don't want to speak about their tradition definitively, just from what I have read, I did see a lot of kind of backbends around, you know, this is a really hard passage and we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, justifying it almost.
Right. And it's like, you know what, we don't actually have to. I don't understand it. I don't know what level of like centrality this passage has. Like, can we look at it and say, this is really disturbing and kind of leave it there? I don't know. I go back and forth, you know. I can understand the desire to kind of dismiss it wholesale and never talk about it. I can also understand the desire to say, I'm not okay with that. And I don't want to worship a God like that. So I have a lot of kind of empathy for folks who settle on all different sides of the fence when they encounter this story. I think what was really interesting to me is the fact that we're still telling the story, the fact that this story has been told and retold over and over, that we continue to sort of wrestle with the horror of it. I found Kierkegaard's reading probably the most compelling, like that the silence of God and the silence of Abraham was probably like the centerpiece of that trial. And I think the question about God, Kierkegaard draws this connection between Abraham and this trial and Mary, mother of Jesus, when she's pregnant and everyone around her can finally see it. It's like he says the angel didn't go around and accommodate for her, make excuses to say, no, she didn't have adultery. She didn't sleep around. Like, this is the Holy Spirit that has impregnated her. God did not do that. If you believe that, let's say within the context of the story, God did not do that. And so you kind of have to reckon with this question of when does faith become stupidity? When does faith actually look like evil? And how do you reckon with that? Because I think that's a question that all of us are probably reckoning with right now, even in the midst of this political climate where it's like some things can just be evil and also some things can look mixed up.
Well, yeah, Nat and I have discussed the Abraham Isaac story quite a few times, and one of the ways I believe Nat brought it to my attention first, but it's one of the ways that I look at it now is, what if Abraham had just said no? And maybe that's what God was looking for, was I'm not that kind of God, and I need you to say no to this. And so it opens up this ability to interpret and to ask questions. And like you said, we're still talking about these stories today. And I think it's important that we're still talking about these stories today and that we go deeper into them, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That question of, God saying no, I started to see this theme of Abraham's passivity and cowardice. You see this man who kind of gives up his wife to Pharaoh, and then a king takes her and he lets that happen. There's sort of over and over he's doing these things. Hagar is thrown out of his house twice and he doesn't speak up for her ever. And in fact, right before that passage of the mountain and Isaac, Abraham is speaking up on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's arguing with God in this really dramatic and interesting discussion. And then you get to this discussion about his son and there's nothing.
Yeah.
So I do think that we're meant to be like, there is something awry with how this man is interpreting God and how this man is interpreting himself and his role as father and patriarch, because he's fucking it up. This is not okay.
Badly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's, because the other question I have then when I approach scripture is, if we remove it, and I have removed it from this place of this is a divine product, and now I see it as a wholly human product. Well, that changes everything. That means the writers doing their best to assign meaning to shit that's happening to them, to interact with what they think God is or isn't, sometimes getting it right, sometimes getting it spectacularly wrong. And and I've said this for years, my shtick now is the Bible's not inerrant, obviously. What it does is, though, I think it unflinchingly, though, and very honestly shows where people were at any given time and place and how they thought about God. And I think we're free to look at those things and say, except they were wrong. They got that wrong. If there was a flood and they were okay, it would not have been, far-flung thinking in the ancient Near East to think that a god or gods sent this calamity Of course, that's what they would think. Does that mean that's literally what happened? No. But in order to make sense of their world, I understand like why you might want to put, or if you want to go to war against a neighboring country, what better way than to say God's on my side and God will, and if we lose, we can say, oh, actually, we fucked up and God delivered us into the hand. We didn't lose. God did this to us to teach us a lesson. And so there's all these interesting questions that now arise as soon as you divorce yourself from the idea that somehow God through the Holy Spirit reached down and grabbed people's pens and ghost wrote through them.
Well, and I would suggest even that you could do all of that and still think that there's some level of kind of magic God dust on the book.
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
I can't tell you how, like, I can't tell you if this book is inspired. I don't really know. I think people who do it selling you Bibles,
I still hold to a level of divine inspiration. But then again, I hold that I on a youth retreat once, and I got in trouble for all kinds of stuff, but this is one I got in a lot of trouble for. They say that the Bible is divinely inspired. I'm like, that's great. So are you. And none of you are perfect, and you all have your flaws, but you're still divinely inspired. God still animates you. God still is there. If we say the Bible's not perfect, we're not saying it's no longer, touched by the divine, but artists are inspired. And sometimes Picasso paints something that looks like what the hell Picasso painted. And sometimes you get Rembrandt. And so anyway, I don't have an issue with that. I just think
that's a much more interesting way to approach the book. I like that a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think where we jump the shark is when at some point, and thank you, Chicago statement of whatever the hell year that was, when somebody, in their collective wisdom had to have this, this ironclad statement of faith that said, the Bible is the inerrant, perfect word of God. Thou shalt not fuck with it. Which I wish they had actually said it like that. It would have been good.
That's what they meant.
That's what they meant. Like how dare, and that was the entirety of my religious upbringing. Was we weren't supposed to question it. We weren't supposed to wrestle with it and grapple with it. If there was an issue with how we read a text, the issue was with us. The text was fine. So if I read a passage that says basically God's fighting with slavery, but really doesn't want you to eat shellfish, I'm not supposed to find the hypocrisy in that, or if that God is fine with whatever, genocide and all kinds of things, but does, the issue is with us, and that does a good job of preserving people's power and their levels of control. But I don't know, you just can't keep that up forever. People like John and you and me and Bethany will eventually go, I don't know, man. Something doesn't smell quite right about that. So it's interesting. But yeah, you're right. It does open up this, it opens up all kinds of, I think, very, very interesting questions.
I like that you brought up the Chicago statement too. That's like a little, I've been working on this essay for the Christian Century that goes into that story of the statement. And it's really fascinating and political and weird.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that I came to in kind of exploring that story of, why did these men, it was about 250 white men in a room who wrote this statement. Why did they need to write this statement? What was behind that? And kind of what I settled on was this question about certainty. And I think that's really what's behind this question about inerrancy. It's like, I want to be able to explain this world and explain God, who is not in a body, cannot be touched and cannot be measured. And we really don't have a way to make our lives make sense that's completely clear. I mean, it's very hard to be human sometimes. Like, there are not answers, and we would like them. I think that's just a human desire.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah, they make us feel safe, and we need that sort of sense of safety in order to feel comfortable. So if God doesn't fit that level of comfort in our lives, then we don't feel safe. And certainty, like seeing God and everything else in binary ways, it provides this level of comfort and safety. And so I totally understand why people long for that, and not just long for it, but actually create rooms with 200 men or 40 men or however many were there, writing a document that everybody can get behind. Because the minute that you do that, the minute you finally know that your faith is sure and everybody else has it wrong. It's really it moves the questions.
Well, and evangelicals we're so bad at history. Like, we're not taught history, you know. I was never ever introduced to any church father, any early church writings, any church history, any of that at all. And I bring that up because that Chicago statement was in 1978. It's not that damn old. It's actually, in terms of biblical scholarship, it is very modern.
Baby.
And so it's in its infancy, and yet I would bet you that a good chunk of people like me who were raised up in that kind of church, number one, we think that everyone, the impression given is that this is Christianity writ large that believes this, and it's really not. It's a very small sliver of the Christian world if you factor in the Orthodox and the Catholic and they think it's old and they think it's Orthodox, and it's none of those things. Which is maybe why they didn't encourage us to read Athanasius and people like that, because we might have started to ask even more questions like, well, hold up, that's not how Origen read the scriptures, and he was. And
they would say, "Who's Origen?"
Yeah. Origen. Oh, you mean the heretic? You mean that heretic that they? I don't know.
If they knew, I mean, that's the irony, though. Is a lot of these men were conflicted.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they know how complex this book is.
Well, the only other time I ever heard say Origen in church would be if I would say the pastor Google searched a quote he needed and he liked it and he posted it, but probably didn't have any idea the history of who he's quoting.
Well, if he did, he wouldn't have quoted him.
Exactly. Exactly.
No. Yeah. You can get in trouble quoting people that are, other people find that are heretics. And yeah, but you're right. And same thing for me. I don't know. Rob Bell was the first guy I heard ever quoted at Origen, and then it set me on set me down a what's the word I'm looking for, John?
Rabbit hole?
Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. It set me down a rabbit hole of like, okay, well, who else haven't I read? Who else have I not paid attention to? And it turns out that all these things that I was thinking that I thought were new and revelatory were not.
Right.
They were old. They were Orthodox. They were apostolic. These were the things that the very, very earliest Christians believed. And I'm like, maybe it's time to at least give these guys, another fair shot. And there were too many of them were men. Yeah, there weren't enough church fathers to go along with the church fathers. I get that. And there is no such thing as orthodoxy, as though, they fought with each other all the time. Half the titles of their damn books are against somebody. Athanasius against the Arians, against the so-and-so. They were fighting with each other all the time about these topics.
It's pretty humanizing.
Yeah. And because you somehow sit here and think that in 2024 we have this settled issue that was handed to us by God, and what we have is a jumble of a mess handed to us by people who fought and scrabbled, sometimes not with the best of motives and intentions, sometimes because of power, and sometimes because of, whatever, not always because of, like Santa St. Nicholas was the guy that punched the dude in the face. I love that story, by the way, over the definition of a word. But anyway, but all of that brings all that humanness into the story that then I think allows you to ask all these other really big questions that are so much more interesting than, was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? I don't care. What's the bigger story? What's the bigger issue here? So that's why I love books like yours that prompt us to think bigger and ask bigger questions.
Yeah. I mean, I look at those, at the story of Jacob with God, wrestling with God, and to be in this relationship with this deity means that it's one where there's wrestling, where there's, you're trying to figure things out, and it's whole body encompassing instead of just downloading some information with answers. It's engaging so deeply and profoundly. And if we're meant to wrestle with God in that way, then we're also meant to wrestle with each other and, pick each other apart. What is it that we understand, and how do we understand? Because the more that I understand how you understand, the greater I understand God. Because your understanding of God is not the same as my understanding of God. That's nothing to fear. That's actually something that brings about a greater experience and perspective.
Totally.
Word.
That's my input. Totally, man.
I love that. Yeah. It reminds me of one of the stories at the end of the book that I tell from the Jewish Midrash so there's the story that the Kabbalists tell, and they are, by the way, the Jewish mystic heretics.
Right.
So go ahead.
No, I was just, my only association with Kabbalah is Madonna.
Yes. So they are heretics. Madonna. Yes. That seems like a good spokesperson for these guys. But the legend goes that 600,000 Jews stood in the shadow of Mount Sinai on the day that God gives Torah to Moses, like the 10 Commandments. So there's 600,000 there, and their theory is that God gave 1/600,000th of the Torah to each person who was there that day. And so in order to assemble the entire Torah, every member of the community needed to come together and share their piece, and each member needed to be heard, and it sort of needed to be reassembled like a puzzle. And I think, evangelicalism is so quick to kind of preference a single interpretation, a single voice that says whether something is true or not. And I think, it makes me excited, Bethany, that you had these ideas that were coming to you from other parts of the scriptures, from what I'd written. That's exactly what I want to happen. Like, I don't want this to become the definitive work on Genesis. I want people to, which by the way, it should not be, but watch a Bergman for that, please.
Yes.
But I don't want that. I want people to come to this text and feel a freedom to engage in a new way, to be creative, and to come with their own thoughts and perspectives and experiences. And I think that creates this much healthier and more diverse and more interesting spirituality overall. And I think we need that in our world, especially, in this time where it feels like Christo-fascism is winning.
Right.
Like
Oof.
we need like that's an authoritarianism, right? Like we don't need the authoritarian reading of the Bible, the inerrant reading that says there's only one way to read this. We need more people at the table. We need a bigger table. We need to give people more microphones, and hear what they have to say about God and about faith. And I think that's where we really find, I think that's where we find God. I don't think we can find God by ourselves. I also don't think we can find God from one voice. I think we really need this group project of people reading God together, even from this text.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of art. And when things are hard, when we have dictators and all sorts of difficulty within governments and within households and everything, art is a form of resistance. It is a form of rebellion in the most creative sense. And it seems like scripture, when we can read it in a form of art as a truth teller, not as a history book, but as this artistic truth teller, there's something so profound that can happen within communities that changes the texture of those communities. But when we come before scripture saying this is, basic instructions before leaving earth, when we look at the Bible or whatever it is, like, then it stops the flow of what the Spirit is doing in people's lives. I've seen it happen I've seen it in my own life, where the Bible was so revered and it was so inerrant. There was nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It was just directly from the Holy Spirit into the hands of the scribes, and they put it together perfectly. And when I've had to uphold that rule, it stops that flow of creativity and movement. And I don't think that it's the way that we're supposed to. I don't mean that the Bible isn't this beautiful, reverent object that we get to plumb the depths of, but I don't see it in the same way as I used to.
Yeah. Well, what was it? Marcus Borg's title? He wrote a book called Reading the Bible Again for the First Time. And the subtitle of that book is Taking the Bible Seriously Enough Not to Take It Literally. And Marcus Borg was a genius. And so big, huge Marcus Borg guy. But that whole notion, because here's the problem with that. Okay, fine. The Bible's inerrant. Even if we start with that presupposition, if I grant you that, it still has to be interpreted. Everybody interprets it. And so now whose interpretation do I believe? Because the guy at the front standing behind the podium claims he's anointed somehow. And so now all conversation is stopped because I got in a lot of trouble and our little church plan experiment didn't last very long. We have a tendency to say stuff like, hey, this passage of scripture is pretty interesting. I don't think it's right. We don't believe this. So just skip that part. We're going to go to the next thing. And it was like a collective gasp of like, well, do you think it's right? That at the same breath that Paul is saying that you're supposed to resist the principalities and the powers, that next thing he's telling you is to obey all your governmental leaders. That sounds like horseshit. Sounds like schizophrenic. And if John Crossan was here today, he'd tell us Paul didn't say that actually. That's going to be a scribal insert. Let's talk about why somebody would mess with the text and de-radicalize Paul. Why would they try to defang Jesus? Because they did. Why would they go and then I think honestly taking all these Genesis stories, all these Old Testament stories and literalizing them defangs them as well, because it robs them of all of the possible resistance language, all of the possible all the subterfuge and all of those things that could be there that are happening behind the scenes because you've just turned it into some weird Bible story that we now make decals of and stick on the walls of our kids' preschool room for some fucking reason, because pictures of the flood and millions of people dying are great for nurseries. So yeah, all of this is great. I love that, and I think that's what we've lost. Maybe that's what I push back against the most is the current structure of the church, where one person, usually a man, stands at the front and tells everyone what to think, versus what used to happen, which was this community reading and wrestling and arguing and talking, and then midrash can happen where you can where the blank spaces are. Let's put some stuff in there that we think makes sense, and I love all that. I mean, I don't know, that's I can buy off on faith that looks like that versus what what I mean? Because that to me is something that is living and breathing, that could potentially meet the needs of people where they're at, could potentially lead to creative solutions to really difficult problems. I mean, we have all of these things that could come about versus, here's the club of the Bible I'm going to hammer you over the head with and just tell you why you're wrong and just shut your brain off. Don't worry about it. Just follow me, which just sends me into, apoplectic shock. It makes you want to just, punch someone in the face. Yeah. It makes me very defensive. It makes me really, I don't know. Makes you just want to turn it all off and go watch Wicked again instead. So, which, by the way, I recommend. Go see that. So we've come full circle, and we could talk to you for a long time, Liz. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. So cool. John, Bethany, I don't want to end it unless if you have something any final thoughts or.
No, just thank you for taking the time to talk with us. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm really, really glad that we got a chance to talk.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Really great. Thanks, Liz.
Knock the Sky. What a great title.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. It was a pleasure to get to talk with you.
Yeah. So is it out on Amazon now, or is it
January?
And January. Okay. Well, by the time this releases, it will be out. So
there you go. Okay, it's out right now.
So go get it. Go buy it. I think this would make a phenomenal small group study.
Oh,
It'd be a really good thing for people to sit around, and 5 or 6 or 7 people sit around, have coffee and talk about, and just give yourself the freedom to ask big questions that maybe up to this point you've been discouraged from asking. I think that's probably the best part about a book like this, that it says, hey, the jury's still out on some of this. Let's talk about it. So by the time you hear this, the book is available. Shop local if you can. Go find you a nice little bookstore. If you can't, if you must, then Amazon will take your money gladly.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.